This is going to be a brief summary of the process and all collected information that led me up to this point. When I began this adventure, I began with an assumption. I assumed that the book of Revelation could very well be understood as historical rather than prophetic. But in order to find history behind the allegories, I needed a foothold in the book. And in beginning my crack of Revelation, I went to the biggest allegory I could find, a king's list in Revelation 17. It mostly fell in line, but I was missing something. That missing part required that I crack Revelation 13. That chapter completed my king's list, and it was also the first indication I had that the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 was involved. Having my king's list in hand, I decided to take a stab at one of the other allegories. The first 5 chapters seemed like a theological prequel, so I began with Revelation 6. This chapter turned out to be the eclipse of 59. It was the most stunning, beautifully written, and precise allegory I could ever have imagined. I had to use NASA's website and a sky map to figure it out, but the Revelation 6 account was so well written that it screamed eyewitness account. Though there were other very strong allegories in this book, Revelation 6 represents the pinnacle of allegorical construction. It can't be done much better than this allegory. From that point on, I attempted to crack the rest of the book. Some allegories were extremely strong, others were a bit underdeveloped, and there were plenty of hidden gems in this book. But in Revelation 12, I found my second eclipse. The eclipse allegory had been borrowed from a Greek source, but there was another allegory in this chapter. The second allegory was about the birth of Christianity. At this point, I simply didn't have any information that would corroborate Christianity being born from the eclipse, so I largely ignored it as theological fiction. Nevertheless, I had 2 verifiable eclipses, and I was beginning to think that an eclipse may very well be important to Christianity. After a few months of doing other things and largely ignoring the eclipse idea, I came across the works of Theophilus of Antioch. According to Theophilus, an eclipse would be a fusion of the perfect representation of God and the perfect representation of man, which is, of course, how Jesus is portrayed in the New Testament. But I wondered about the cosmology, and after reading the book of Enoch, I came into the idea that the sun was male and the moon was female. An eclipse, according to this model, could be seen as a marriage or sex, and if it was some version of sex, then the question then becomes, what does it birth? I now had 2 models, one well before the eclipse accounts and one well after the accounts. Both cosmological understandings were consistent with parts of the Jesus story, and both were consistent with an eclipse first model of Jesus. So at this point, I jumped into the New Testament, early Christian writings, and apocryphal books. What I found was that Matthew and all 3 synoptic gospels described the coming of the eclipse of 71, and they all described it as a sign of Jesus. At this point, I began to rethink my Revelation 12 objection. I had discounted the birth allegory as theological fiction, yet all the synoptic gospels were pointing here, and none of the synoptic gospels seemed to mention the 59 eclipse. So I dropped my objection and went forward. I wanted to see what the John Gospel said, and at first I was very disappointed. It didn't seem to mention any eclipse event. I was, however, aware of the Logos concept of John, and after going through this creation philosophy, it became crystal clear that John was talking about light, and the apocryphal books support the John understanding. The eclipse was the sign of Jesus, but it was the light that was literally Jesus, and back in the Synoptic Gospels, they support this light understanding as well. The Synoptic Gospels claim that after the eclipse, Jesus appeared in the clouds. Jesus appears literally to be light. And in the Pauline account, his entire existence depends on Paul going blind because of light. That was the vision of Jesus. The Revelation 12 allegory, the birth event for Jesus and Christianity, appears to be telling the truth. This was not just any random event. This was the birth event for Christianity and most of later Christian theology. At this point, I don't know where I'm going with this. I could not have expected this a few months ago, but now every time I read something from this period, it falls in line. This was only a fact-finding mission. I had no intention of discovering Jesus. The eclipse model of Jesus is simply the result of evidence. This model is a surprise to me. I stumbled onto this. I definitely was not trying to find this. But the evidence at this point is overwhelming. I don't know how much evidence I need, but I have far more than I expected. Everything seems to point here, and I have no idea what I'm going to find next. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for their questions and comments. You have been a huge factor in getting me to this point. Without you, I probably would have stopped a long time ago.